My wife of 15 years left me to go back to her ex and told me she never really loved me. The next day, her lawyer called me in a panic. Before continuing the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories and leave your like on the video. I need to tell you about the night that changed everything, the night I thought I was breaking my husband's heart, but ended up walking straight into my own destruction. It was our 15th wedding anniversary. I had planned it all perfectly. The expensive restaurant downtown, the champagne, even wore the red dress he bought me 3 years ago that I'd never touched. But not for the reasons he might have hoped. I remember sitting across from him at that candle-lit table, watching him smile as he raised his glass for a toast. To 15 years of... He started, but I cut him off. I don't love you, I said. Just like that. Cold. Direct. I never did. I expected shock, maybe tears, pleading. Instead, he simply set down his glass and nodded slowly, as if I'd just told him it might rain tomorrow. I see, he said quietly. And I suppose you have plans. I'm going back to him, to Marcus. I should have never left him for you. The words felt so rehearsed because they were. I'd practiced this moment for weeks, imagining the devastation on his face. But there was no devastation. Just that same calm expression, maybe even a hint of relief. Well then, he said, cutting into his steak like we were discussing weekend plans. I suppose you should pack your things. This wasn't the script I'd written in my head. Where was the begging? The promises to change? The dramatic scene that would make me feel powerful and wanted? That's it? I snapped. 15 years and that's all you have to say? He looked up at me then, and for just a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not sadness, something else, something that made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. What would you like me to say? He asked. You've made your decision. You're an adult. I respect that. I felt cheated somehow. I'd built this whole moment up in my mind. Me as the powerful woman finally taking control. Him as the devastated husband realizing what he'd lost. But sitting there, watching him calmly finish his dinner while I sat in stunned silence, I felt like an actress who'd forgotten her lines. I'll be gone by tomorrow night, I said, trying to regain some control of the situation. Take your time, he replied. I'll be working late anyway. Big case coming up. The drive home was torture. I kept glancing at him, waiting for some crack in that serene facade, but nothing came. He even turned on the radio and hummed along to some jazz tune like it was any other evening. When we got home, he kissed my forehead, and said, I hope you find what you're looking for. Then he went to his office and closed the door. I stood in our hallway, surrounded by 15 years of shared life, and felt more alone than I ever had. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I was supposed to be the one in control, the one walking away victorious. Instead, I felt like I'd just confessed to a priest who'd simply said, go in peace. As I climbed the stairs to start packing, I heard the soft click of his office door locking. For the first time that evening, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I'd underestimated the man I'd been married to for 15 years. But by then, it was already too late to take it back. The next morning, I decided to put on the show of my life. If he wanted to play it cool, I'd make sure he understood exactly what he was losing. I started early, dragging suitcases down the stairs with unnecessary noise, making sure each thud echoed through the house. I wanted him to hear the sound of his wife leaving, to feel the weight of what was happening. But when I glanced toward his office, the door remained closed. I could hear him on a phone call, his voice steady and professional. Business as usual. Fine. If subtlety wasn't working, I'd be more direct. I called Marcus right there in the living room, speaking just loud enough to be heard. Baby, I told him, yes, it's really happening. I can't wait to be with you again. Marcus sounded surprised. We'd talked about this moment for months, but I don't think he truly believed I'd go through with it. Are you sure about this? He asked. I mean, after all these years? I'm sure, I said, louder than necessary. I should have never married him in the first place. We both know that. I hung up and waited for some reaction from the office. Nothing. I started going through our photos, making a deliberate show of removing myself from the frames. Our wedding picture on the mantle. I took it down and left just the empty frame. Our vacation photos from Italy. I cut myself out with scissors, leaving him alone in every shot. Still nothing from the office. By afternoon, I was getting desperate. I called my sister and had the most dramatic conversation of my life, complete with fake tears and declarations about finally finding real love. I talked about how I'd been living a lie, how I deserved better, how Marcus understood me in ways my husband never could. "Are you really sure about this?" my sister asked. "I mean, he's been good to you. And Marcus, well, you know how he is." "I know exactly how he is," I said. "He's passionate. He makes me feel alive." What I didn't tell her was that Marcus was also unemployed, living in a tiny apartment, and had a tendency to disappear when things got difficult. But those details didn't fit the narrative I was creating. Around 4 o'clock, I heard the office door open. Finally. I positioned myself strategically by the front door with my suitcases, ready for our final confrontation. He emerged, straightened his tie, and grabbed his car keys. "I'm leaving," I announced, gesturing to my luggage. "I can see that," he said. "Drive safely." And then he was gone. Just like that. Off to work like it was any other Tuesday. I stood there holding my suitcases, feeling utterly deflated. Where was the fight for our marriage? Where were the desperate pleas for me to stay? Marcus picked me up an hour later. As we drove away from the house, I kept looking back, waiting for my husband to come racing after us, but the driveway remained empty, and the house looked as peaceful as ever. "He just let you go?" Marcus asked, seeming almost disappointed by the lack of drama. "Like I meant nothing to him," I replied, though something about that didn't sit right with me. That night, lying in Marcus's cramped apartment, I couldn't shake the image of my husband's face at dinner. That strange flicker in his eyes, and the way he'd locked his office door afterward. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," I lied. "Just happy to finally be here." But I wasn't thinking about nothing. I was thinking about how my husband had seemed almost prepared, like he'd been expecting this conversation, like he'd already made his own plans. I told myself I was being paranoid. He was probably just in shock, processing the end of his marriage the only way he knew how, with that lawyer's calm I'd grown so tired of over the years. Still, as I drifted off to sleep in unfamiliar sheets, I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd just made a terrible miscalculation. What I didn't know was that the moment my car disappeared around the corner, my husband was already moving. He didn't waste time on grief or self-pity. Instead, he walked straight to his home office, unlocked a filing cabinet I'd never paid attention to, and pulled out a thick folder labeled Contingency Plans, Personal. You see, my husband wasn't just any lawyer. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in protecting assets for wealthy clients going through nasty divorces. He'd seen every trick, every loophole, every way a vengeful spouse could destroy someone financially, and he'd spent years quietly protecting himself from exactly what I thought I was about to do to him. The first call he made was to his business partner. "It's happening," he said simply. "Execute Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was something he'd established 3 years into our marriage, right around the time I'd started becoming distant and critical. It wasn't that he suspected me of infidelity then, he just recognized the signs of a marriage that might not last, and he was nothing if not thorough. Over the years, he'd gradually moved our assets into a complex web of trusts and holding companies. Not to hide money, everything was perfectly legal and above board, but to protect it from what lawyers call marital waste and dissipation of assets. The post-nuptial agreement I'd signed 7 years ago, the one his partner had suggested for tax purposes, contained very specific clauses about voluntary abandonment of the marital home and adultery. At the time, I'd barely read it. I trusted him, and the language was so dense and legal that I just signed where he pointed. That agreement was now worth more than gold. Within 2 hours of my departure, every joint account had been legally restructured. My access wasn't simply removed. It was transferred to trusts that I had no legal claim to, thanks to the abandonment clause I'd triggered by leaving voluntarily for another man. The house, which I'd always assumed was half mine, had actually been held in a revocable trust for years. My signature on dozens of documents over the years, refinancing papers, insurance updates, tax filings, had gradually shifted my ownership into contingent rights that evaporated the moment I left for another man. Even our cars were affected. The BMW I'd been driving, registered to his law firm as a company vehicle for tax purposes. The Mercedes in the garage, part of a lease agreement through one of his holding companies. He didn't steal anything. He didn't hide assets illegally. He'd simply spent years creating a legal structure that would protect him if his marriage ended badly, and my dramatic exit had triggered every single protection he'd put in place. By the time the banks opened the next morning, the transformation was complete. What had looked like a 50-50 split of marital assets the day before was now legally and irrevocably his alone. The most brilliant part? None of it required a court battle. No nasty divorce proceedings. No public drama. Just the quiet execution of contracts and agreements that I myself had signed. His business partner called him around midnight. "It's done. Everything's protected. She'll find out tomorrow when she tries to access the accounts." "Good," my husband replied. "Make sure all the documentation is ready. Something tells me we're going to need it soon." He wasn't being vindictive. He was being practical. After 15 years of marriage, he knew me well enough to predict my next moves, and he was already 3 steps ahead of every single one of them. As he finally went to bed that night, alone in a house that was now entirely his, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: relief. Not because his marriage was over, but because he no longer had to pretend he didn't see it ending. The next afternoon, while I was still basking in what I thought was my newfound freedom, my husband was building his case. It started with a phone call from his private investigator. Yes, he'd hired one months ago when my behavior became suspicious. Nothing dramatic or paranoid, just due diligence from a man who'd seen too many nasty surprises in divorce court. "I've got something you need to see," the investigator said. "Check your email." The photograph that appeared in his inbox was devastating in its simplicity. There I was, yesterday morning, hours before our anniversary dinner, wrapped in Marcus's arms outside his apartment building. The timestamp showed 11:47 a.m., but it wasn't just the photo. The investigator had been thorough. Phone records showing months of calls to Marcus, credit card statements revealing payments to a hotel where we'd been meeting, even parking tickets from my car being in Marcus's neighborhood going back 6 months. The evidence painted a clear picture. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of an anniversary dinner. This was a calculated, long-term affair that I'd been planning to reveal for months. More importantly, for legal purposes, it proved premeditation. The post-nuptial agreement I'd signed contained very specific language about planned adultery versus temporary indiscretion. If I'd confessed to a one-night stand, I might have retained some rights to marital assets. But this was exactly what those clauses were designed to address. My husband printed everything. Every photo, every phone record, every hotel receipt. He organized it all in neat folders with tabs and dates, the way he'd organize evidence for any other case. Then he made copies and sent them to his attorney, his accountant, and his business partner. Not for revenge, but for protection. He knew that once I discovered what had happened to our assets, I'd come after him legally. These documents would ensure that any challenge I mounted would be quickly dismissed. The most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: me. Apparently, in my excitement about finally leaving, I'd posted that photo with Marcus on my social media with the caption, "Finally free to love who I want to love." The timestamp? Posted at 3:22 p.m. on our anniversary day, just 2 hours before our dinner. That single post proved everything. It showed that my confession at dinner wasn't spontaneous honesty. It was the final act in a performance I'd been planning for months. I'd literally documented my own premeditation. His business partner called again that evening. "Did you see her Instagram?" I did. This makes everything ironclad. No judge would ever overturn those agreements now, even if she claimed she didn't understand what she was signing. She's literally admitted to everything in writing. What I didn't realize as I posted that photo, feeling so proud and defiant, was that I was providing the final nail in my own legal coffin. Every heart emoji, every comment from friends congratulating me on finally following my heart, every detail I shared about leaving my boring marriage for real love, it all became evidence of deliberate marital misconduct. My husband didn't feel victorious looking at the evidence. He felt sad. Sad that the woman he'd loved had been living a lie for months. Sad that she'd turned their anniversary into a stage for her grand finale. Sad that she'd been so careless about documenting her own betrayal. But he also felt validated. Every precaution he'd taken, every legal structure he'd put in place, every protection he'd quietly built, it had all been necessary. I'd just proven that beyond any doubt. As he filed the evidence away in his safe that night, he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Tomorrow, I would discover what my choices had cost me, and knowing my temperament, I wouldn't accept it quietly. He was right about that too. I found out the next morning when I tried to buy groceries. Standing in the checkout line at Marcus's neighborhood market, my card was declined. Not just once, 3 times. The cashier looked embarrassed as she handed it back to me. "Try this one," I said. pulling out our joint credit card. Declined. Maybe try calling your bank? She suggested gently. I stepped outside, my face burning with humiliation, and dialed the customer service number. After 20 minutes on hold and multiple transfers, I finally reached someone who could help. I need to know why my cards aren't working, I said. Ma'am, I show that you were removed as an authorized user on these accounts yesterday at 2:15 p.m. Removed? By who? The primary account holder. It shows here that he submitted the proper documentation to remove your access in accordance with your joint account agreement. What documentation? What agreement? I can't discuss specific details over the phone, ma'am, but I can tell you that all actions were taken in accordance with the legal agreements on file. You should have received notification by mail. I hung up and immediately called our main bank. Same story. Then our investment accounts. Same story. Then our credit union. Same story everywhere. Marcus found me crying in his kitchen an hour later. What's wrong, baby? He froze everything. Every account, every card. I can't access any of our money. He can't do that. Can he? I mean, it's your money too. I was wondering the same thing. This had to be illegal. He couldn't just cut me off from our marital assets because I left him. Could he? I called the divorce attorney my sister had recommended. Her secretary squeezed me in for an emergency consultation that afternoon. The attorney listened patiently as I explained the situation. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and requested copies of any financial documents I had access to. The problem is, she said finally, I need to see the post-nuptial agreement you mentioned signing. Without knowing what you agreed to, I can't tell you if his actions are legal or not. I don't have a copy. He handled all that paperwork. Did you read it before you signed it? I felt my face flush. Not carefully. It was for tax purposes. At least, that's what he said. She nodded knowingly. That's not uncommon. Let me reach out to his attorney and request copies of all relevant documents. In the meantime, don't sign anything else. Don't admit to anything in writing and document everything that's happening. How long will this take? These things usually take weeks or months to sort out. Do you have access to any funds in the meantime? I thought about the $43 in my purse. Not really. I see. Well, let's start with a retainer fee of $5,000 to begin representation. $5,000? I couldn't even buy groceries. That evening, I swallowed my pride and called my husband. I need access to our accounts, I said without preamble. Hello to you too, he replied calmly. This is serious. I can't access any money. I can't even buy food. I understand that must be difficult. So you'll fix it? There was a long pause. I can't fix what isn't broken. Everything that's happened is in accordance with the agreements we both signed. What agreements? I don't remember agreeing to be cut off from our money if I left you. The post-nuptial agreement from 2018. Section 12, subsection C specifically addresses voluntary abandonment of the marital home for purposes of adultery. Your attorney will explain it to you. My attorney says she needs to see a copy. She can request it through proper legal channels. I'm sure her paralegal knows how to file the appropriate motions. I was stunned by his formality. This was the man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, and he was talking to me like I was opposing counsel in a case. I can't afford an attorney without access to our money, I said desperately. That sounds like a personal problem you'll need to solve. And then he hung up. I sat in Marcus's cramped apartment, staring at my silent phone, finally understanding that I wasn't just dealing with a hurt husband. I was dealing with a lawyer who'd been prepared for this exact scenario. For the first time since I'd left, I felt genuinely afraid. 3 days later, my attorney called with news that made my blood run cold. I've received the documents from your husband's counsel, she said, her voice noticeably different from our first meeting. More formal, more distant. And? Can you come in today? This is something we need to discuss in person. I took the bus to her office, counting out exact change from the few dollars I had left. Marcus had loaned me money for the consultation, but even he was starting to ask uncomfortable questions about when I'd be able to contribute financially. The attorney's conference room table was covered with documents, neat stacks, color-coded tabs, everything organized with the precision I remembered from my husband's home office. Before we begin, she said, I need to inform you that based on these documents, your case is challenging. What do you mean challenging? She opened the first folder. The post-nuptial agreement you signed is extraordinarily comprehensive. It's also completely legal and binding. She walked me through it page by page. the voluntary abandonment clause, the adultery provisions, the asset protection structures, the revocation of rights upon specific triggering events. Basically, she explained, you agreed that if you left the marriage for another person, you would forfeit all claims to marital assets acquired after the date of the agreement. But I thought post-nups were about taxes and estate planning. They can be. But this one is primarily about asset protection. Your husband clearly had it drafted by someone who specializes in high net worth divorce planning. She opened another folder. And then there's this: photographs, phone records, credit card statements, hotel receipts, all documenting my affair with Marcus going back months. Where did he get all this? Private investigator, most likely. It's all perfectly legal. No laws were broken in obtaining this evidence. The final folder contained printouts of my social media posts. The photo with Marcus. My captions about being finally free. Comments from friends congratulating me on leaving my boring husband. This proves premeditation, she said. You didn't leave impulsively. You planned this for months while maintaining the charade of your marriage. I felt sick. So what are my options? She closed the folders. Honestly, very limited. You could challenge the validity of the post-nuptial agreement, but given the evidence of your long-term affair and the fact that you had independent legal counsel review it before signing, I had independent legal counsel? According to the documents, yes. A family law attorney reviewed the agreement and advised you of your rights before you signed it. There's her certification right here. I stared at the signature. I vaguely remembered meeting with a female attorney years ago, but I'd been so focused on what my husband had told me about tax benefits that I barely paid attention to her explanations. She told you explicitly that you were waiving significant rights in the event of marital misconduct or abandonment. It's all documented in her notes, which your husband's attorney has also provided. The attorney leaned back in her chair. I'm going to be frank with you. This case would cost tens of thousands of dollars to litigate, and the likelihood of success is very low. Your husband was extremely thorough in protecting his assets. So he just gets to keep everything? He gets to keep what the legal agreements say he can keep. Yes. And based on your actions, the affair, the planned abandonment, the documentation of premeditation, those agreements are fully enforceable. I sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the scope of what had happened to me. There is one more thing, she said quietly. Your husband's attorney called this morning. About what? They have an offer. If you agree not to contest the post-nuptial agreement and sign a final settlement acknowledging your forfeiture of marital assets, they'll provide you with $25,000 to help you transition to your new life. $25,000. After 15 years of marriage. And if I don't sign, then you'll spend years in court fighting agreements you voluntarily signed, spending money you don't have with very little chance of winning, and you'll end up with nothing except massive legal bills. I understood now why my husband had seemed so calm at dinner. He hadn't been shocked by my confession. He'd been prepared for it. He'd been preparing for years. I thought I'd hit rock bottom after the meeting with my attorney. I was wrong. Marcus and I were having dinner in his tiny kitchen. Takeout pizza that he'd paid for, when someone knocked on the door. Heavy official knocking that made us both freeze. Are you expecting someone? I asked. Marcus shook his head and went to answer it. Through the thin walls, I could hear voices, his nervous and questioning, the other calm and professional. What's going on? I called out. Marcus returned to the kitchen holding an official-looking envelope, his face pale. It's an eviction notice. What? But you've been living here for 3 years. That's what I thought. His hands were shaking as he opened the document. But apparently, the building was sold 6 months ago. New management company. They're saying my lease was invalidated because... He stopped reading and looked up at me with something close to panic. Because what? Because I was never supposed to be living here. The lease I signed was with a company that didn't own the building. I grabbed the notice and read it myself. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Marcus's lease was fraudulent. He'd been living in the apartment illegally for months. He had 30 days to vacate. Who owns the building now? I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. Marcus flipped through the attached documents. Something called Meridian Properties, LLC. I'd heard that name before. Recently. I couldn't place where, but it sounded familiar. There's more, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're also filing a civil suit against me for unpaid rent and property damage. They're claiming I owe them $48,000. For what? For living here without a valid lease for the past 6 months. Plus penalties and legal fees. The next morning, I called the management company pretending to be a prospective tenant just to understand what was happening. Meridian Properties? Yes, we manage several buildings in that area. Bought them from a private investment firm earlier this year. Really cleaned up some problematic tenant situations. Problematic how? People living in units without proper leases, that sort of thing. The previous owners were very careless about documentation. We've had to evict quite a few people who thought they had valid rental agreements. After I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Too convenient. Too perfectly timed with everything else that was happening. I spent hours on my phone, calling city records departments, trying to trace the ownership of Marcus's building. What I found made me physically sick. Meridian Properties LLC was owned by another company, which was owned by another company, which was ultimately owned by a trust. A trust controlled by a law firm. My husband's law firm. He didn't just own my refuge, he'd owned it the entire time. Marcus had been paying rent to my husband for 3 years without knowing it. When I told Marcus what I'd discovered, he didn't believe me at first. That's impossible. I found this place through a rental agency. I've never had any contact with your husband. The rental agency was probably just a front. Think about it. How did you afford this place on your salary? The rent was always below market rate, wasn't it? His face crumpled as he realized I was right. The apartment that had seemed like such a lucky find, affordable, available immediately, no credit check required, had been a trap from the beginning. He's been watching us, I said, the full scope of my husband's planning finally becoming clear. He knew about the affair before I even told him. He controlled where we met, where we thought we could hide. So what happens now? I looked around the small apartment that I'd thought represented freedom and fresh starts. Now we get evicted, and you get sued for money you don't have, and we have nowhere to go. Can't you ask him to what? Show mercy? He's not doing this out of spite, Marcus. He's doing it because it's legal and because we made it necessary. That night, as I lay on the couch in what I now knew was my husband's property, I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me. Not just the financial consequences, but the psychological ones. He'd let me believe I was choosing my own path while ensuring that every step I took was on ground he owned. I wasn't just broke and homeless. I was utterly, completely outmaneuvered. And the worst part? Everything he'd done was perfectly legal. The call I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday morning. Our daughter calling from college, her voice sharp with accusation. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, but I still wasn't prepared for the anger in her voice. "Sweetheart, I can explain." Dad sent me some documents, financial records, text messages, photos. Her voice cracked. "Tell me they're fake." My heart sank. I should have known he'd reach out to her first on his terms, with his evidence neatly organized and explained. "It's complicated, honey. Adults sometimes grow apart." "This isn't about growing apart," she shouted. "You were cheating on him for months. While he was paying for my tuition, while he was working 60-hour weeks to support us, you were sneaking around with some loser." "Marcus isn't a loser." "Really?" "Because Dad's investigator found out he's been unemployed for 8 months. He's been lying to you about having a job while you've been lying to Dad about having an affair. You're perfect for each other." The bitterness in her voice was devastating. This was my little girl, the child I'd raised, spoken to every day since she'd left for college. "Your father hired an investigator behind my back?" "Behind your back? Mom, you were meeting your boyfriend in hotels. You posted about it on social media. What did you expect him to do? Just wait for you to destroy the family?" I tried to explain about feeling trapped, about rediscovering love, about how sometimes marriages just end. But every word I spoke seemed to make her angrier. "Do you know what he told me when I called him crying?" she asked. "He said he was sorry I had to find out this way, but that he wanted me to understand the truth before you called with your version of events. He said he didn't want our relationship affected by the mistakes he and you had made." What mistakes had he made? He blamed himself for not being a better husband. Can you believe that? You cheat on him for months, and he's wondering what he could have done differently. The conversation continued for another painful hour. She'd seen the evidence of my affair, the financial documents showing how my abandonment had triggered the asset protection measures, even screenshots of my social media posts celebrating my freedom. "The worst part," she said finally, "is that I defended you. When Dad's business partner called to give me a heads up about what was happening, I told him there had to be a mistake. I said my mom would never be that selfish and cruel. I'm still your mother. Are you? Because the mother I knew wouldn't have humiliated her family like this. The mother I knew wouldn't have thrown away 15 years of marriage for some unemployed guy she was sleeping with in cheap hotels. She hung up before I could respond. I called back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her message had changed. "Hi, you've reached me. I'm taking some time to process recent family developments, so I might not return calls right away. If this is urgent, please text me." I texted her dozens of times over the next few days. Apologies, explanations, desperate pleas for understanding. Most went unanswered. The few responses I got were cold and brief. "Need space. Can't talk right now. Please stop." A week later, I saw on her social media that she'd changed her profile picture. It was a photo of her and her father from her high school graduation. Just the two of them, both smiling. The message was clear. I called her roommate, desperate for any connection to my daughter. "She's been really upset," her roommate told me quietly. "She keeps saying she doesn't know who you are anymore. She showed me some of the stuff her dad sent her. And honestly, I don't know what to tell her." "What kind of stuff?" "Text messages between you and that guy, talking about how boring her dad was, how you couldn't wait to leave him. She said there were months of messages like that, and in some of them you were making fun of things her dad did, things that she remembered differently." My stomach dropped. I'd forgotten about some of those messages with Marcus, the way we'd bonded over complaining about our respective situations. I'd vented about my husband's habits, his predictability, his lack of passion. Things that seemed harmless when I was caught up in the excitement of an affair, but looked cruel and petty when read by his daughter. "There was also something about money," the roommate continued. "She said her dad had been putting extra money aside for her graduate school, working extra cases to build up her college fund, while you were spending money on hotel rooms and gifts for your boyfriend. Every detail made it worse. My husband hadn't just been passively accepting my betrayal. He'd been actively protecting our daughter's future, while I was actively undermining our family's present." "Is she dating anyone?" I asked, grasping for some connection to her life. "Yeah, actually. She's been seeing this guy from her economics class for a few months now. Really nice kid. His parents are divorced too, but he says at least they were honest about it instead of lying and cheating. Even my daughter's relationship choices were being influenced by my actions. 2 weeks after our first conversation, she called me back. Her voice was steady, but there was a finality to it that terrified me. "I've made a decision," she said. "I'm not taking sides in your divorce, but I am choosing who I want to model my life after. Dad worked for 20 years to build something stable for our family. You threw it away for excitement. I know which example I want to follow. That's not fair. You're getting his version of events. I'm getting his evidence. There's a difference. When you have some evidence that contradicts what I've seen, let me know. Until then, I need to focus on my studies and my future." The line went dead. That night, I realized that I hadn't just lost my marriage and my financial security. I'd lost my daughter's respect, maybe permanently. And unlike the money in the house, there was no legal agreement that could get that back for me. My husband had won the most important battle of all, the one for our child's loyalty, and he'd won it simply by telling the truth. Marcus thought he was having a bad week with the eviction notice. Then the lawsuit arrived. I watched him read through the legal documents, his face growing paler with each page. This wasn't just about back rent anymore. This was about fraudulent interference with marital assets and conspiracy to commit adultery. "I don't understand half of these charges," he said, his hands shaking. "What's tortious interference with contractual relations?" I'd learned enough legal terminology over the past month to translate. "It means they're saying you knowingly interfered with my marriage contract." But I didn't know about any marriage contract. I just knew you were unhappy. Doesn't matter. The law doesn't require you to know about specific contracts, just that you knew I was married and you helped me violate my marital obligations. The lawsuit was comprehensive and devastating. My husband's attorneys had documented every hotel room Marcus and I had used, every dinner he'd paid for, every gift we'd exchanged. They'd calculated the total cost of our affair and were demanding that Marcus reimburse those expenses as marital waste. But the most damaging charge was conspiracy. By allowing me to use his apartment as a meeting place, by encouraging me to leave my husband, by accepting my financial contributions to our dates, even though they came from marital accounts, Marcus had made himself a party to the systematic violation of my post-nuptial agreement. "They're saying I owe them $68,000, Marcus said, staring at the damage calculation. "I don't have $68,000. I don't have $6,000. There's more, I said, reading ahead in the document. They're also requesting an injunction preventing you from benefiting from any assets that should legally belong to my husband. What does that mean? It means if I have anything that's technically his, which is apparently everything, you can't use it. The apartment we're living in, any money I might get, even gifts I gave you that were purchased with marital funds. Marcus stood up abruptly and started pacing the small kitchen. This is insane. I didn't steal anything. I didn't break into your house and take his money. We fell in love. We had an affair, I corrected. And according to the law, affairs have financial consequences. The next blow came 3 days later. Marcus's employer called, his part-time landscaping job that he'd finally found after months of unemployment. They ran a background check, he told me after the call. The lawsuit shows up. They don't want to deal with the liability of employing someone involved in ongoing litigation. So now he was unemployed again, facing a massive lawsuit with an eviction deadline approaching in 2 weeks. Maybe I should just declare bankruptcy, he said that night. Bankruptcy doesn't discharge debts incurred through fraudulent activity, and they're calling this fraud. So what am I supposed to do? I didn't have an answer. My husband's legal strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Make the cost of the affair so devastating that it would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider interfering with his life. The final piece of Marcus's destruction came from an unexpected source, his ex-wife. Apparently, she'd seen news of the lawsuit and decided to pursue the back child support he owed her, reasoning that if he had money for hotels and dinners with me, he had money for his kids. She's filing a motion to garnish any wages I might earn, he told me, waving another set of legal papers. And she's requesting that the court investigate whether I was hiding income while I was claiming I couldn't afford child support. Were you hiding income? No, but I was spending money on you instead of saving it for child support payments. Her lawyer is arguing that shows I was capable of meeting my obligations, but chose not to. Marcus was being systematically destroyed from multiple directions. My husband wasn't just going after him for the affair. He was exposing every corner of Marcus's life to legal scrutiny. I think I need to disappear, Marcus said one evening. Just pack up and move to another state. Start over. That would make everything worse. They'd add fleeing jurisdiction to the charges. So I'm trapped. We're both trapped. That night, as Marcus sat at his kitchen table surrounded by legal papers he couldn't afford to fight, I realized that my husband had accomplished something remarkable. He'd made sure that everyone who participated in destroying his marriage would pay a price proportional to their involvement. I'd lost my assets and my daughter. Marcus was losing his freedom, his financial future, and any hope of a normal life. And my husband? He was sleeping peacefully in a house that was entirely his, with a bank account that was entirely his, and a daughter who respected him more than ever. Justice, it turned out, was a lot more thorough than I'd expected. I requested the meeting because I still believed I had some power left, some ability to negotiate, to appeal to 15 years of shared history, to find a way out of the corner I'd painted myself into. We met at his office on a Saturday morning. Neutral ground, he'd said, though nothing about this felt neutral when I was sitting across from him in the same conference room where he met with clients. He looked good, rested. There was a calmness about him that I'd never seen during our marriage, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. You wanted to talk, he said, folding his hands on the polished table. I want to understand what you want from me. I don't want anything from you. Everything I need, I already have. Then why the lawsuit against Marcus? Why destroy him too? I'm not destroying anyone. I'm enforcing legal agreements and protecting my assets. Marcus made choices that had legal consequences. Adults are responsible for their choices. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. I recorded some of our conversations. The ones where you said you loved me, where you talked about our future together. I could make things difficult for you professionally if I wanted to. He looked at the phone with something that might have been amusement. You recorded our conversations? Some of them. And you think that gives you leverage? I think it shows that this marriage wasn't as one-sided as you're making it seem. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small device I didn't recognize. This is a digital recorder. I've been using it for months. Would you like to hear some of your conversations with Marcus? My blood went cold. You recorded me? I recorded conversations that took place on my property, completely legal with proper notification, which was provided in the home security system disclosure you signed 2 years ago. He pressed a button, and suddenly my voice filled the room. Me talking to Marcus about how boring my husband was. Me laughing about his predictable habits. Me complaining about having to pretend to be interested in his work stories. Please turn it off. There's hours of this. Months of you describing your marriage as a prison, your husband as an obstacle to your happiness, your daughter as the only thing keeping you from leaving. He stopped the recording. Your phone recordings might be embarrassing for me. Mine would be devastating for you, especially the parts where you discuss taking half of everything in a divorce and using it to start a new life with Marcus. I felt the last of my fight drain away. Even my secret weapon had been anticipated and neutralized. What do you want me to say? I asked quietly. I want you to understand that this isn't personal. You violated a contract. There are consequences for violating contracts. I'm not punishing you out of spite. I'm protecting myself according to agreements we both signed. It feels personal. I'm sure it does. But feelings don't determine legal reality. He opened another folder. Your attorney mentioned you might be interested in the settlement offer. $25,000 and a clean separation. $25,000 after 15 years of marriage. $25,000 more than you're entitled to under the post-nuptial agreement. It's generous. And if I don't sign, then we proceed with the current legal framework. You continue to have no access to marital assets. Marcus continues to face litigation for his role in violating those assets. And eventually you'll both be forced to declare bankruptcy anyway. He slid a document across the table. This releases all claims to marital property, acknowledges that the asset transfers were legal and binding, and includes a non-disclosure agreement preventing you from discussing the details of our marriage or divorce. You want to buy my silence. I want to end this cleanly. For everyone involved. I stared at the papers. Can I ask you something? Of course. Did you ever love me? Really? For the first time since I'd entered the room, his composed facade cracked slightly. I loved the woman I married. I grieved for years watching her turn into someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look me in the eye every day while betraying everything we'd built together. I'm still that woman. No, you're not. That woman wouldn't have planned this betrayal for months. That woman wouldn't have documented her contempt for her family on social media. That woman wouldn't have brought her lover into our home. I never brought Marcus to our house. The apartment building. I've owned it for 3 years. Every time you met him there, you were on my property, using my resources to betray my trust. The scope of his preparation was still staggering to me. How long have you known? Known about Marcus specifically? 6 months. Suspected you were unhappy and planning to leave? About 3 years? Started protecting my assets just in case? 7 years ago, right after I handled a particularly nasty divorce case that reminded me how quickly love can turn into destruction. He stood up. You have until Monday to decide about the settlement. After that, the offer expires and we proceed through the courts. As I left his office, I realized that I'd been fighting a war that was over before it began. Not because he was smarter than me, but because he'd been honest about who he was while I'd been living a lie about who I was becoming. The saddest part was that he was right. I wasn't the woman he'd married anymore. I'd just been too caught up in my own drama to realize what I'd lost in the process of becoming someone else. I signed the settlement on Monday morning. Not because I wanted to, but because my attorney made it clear that I had no other rational choice. $25,000 and a clean exit, or years of litigation that would cost more than that and end with the same result. You're making the smart decision, she told me as I initialed each page. Your husband constructed an airtight legal strategy. Fighting it would be financial suicide. The signing process was conducted entirely through attorneys. I never saw my husband again. Just paperwork, signatures, notarizations, and the systematic dismantling of 15 years of marriage reduced to legal language and numbered clauses. The most humiliating part was the acknowledgement section, where I had to affirm in writing that I understood the consequences of my actions and that all asset transfers had been conducted legally and in accordance with agreements I had voluntarily signed. I hereby acknowledge that my voluntary abandonment of the marital home for purposes of engaging in an adulterous relationship constituted a material breach of the post-nuptial agreement dated March 15, 2018. Signing that felt like signing my own obituary. The non-disclosure agreement was even worse. I was legally prohibited from discussing the details of our marriage, the financial arrangements, or the circumstances of our divorce. Not just publicly, but with anyone except my attorney and immediate family. This means I can't even tell people why I left, I said. You can say you're divorced, my attorney explained. You just can't discuss the financial aspects or make statements that might damage your ex-husband's reputation. What if people ask why I'm broke? You'll need to be creative about how you answer that. The final insult was the timeline. Because everything had been handled through private trusts and contractual agreements rather than traditional divorce proceedings, the entire process was completed in 6 weeks. No waiting periods, no cooling off requirements, no opportunity for second thoughts. By the time the papers were filed with the court, our marriage was already history in every way that mattered. The $25,000 lasted 3 months. Marcus and I used most of it to relocate to another state, hoping distance would help us start over. But the legal judgments followed us. His credit was destroyed. Mine wasn't much better. Finding housing, employment, or even basic services became a constant struggle. The lawsuit against Marcus was eventually settled for $12,000, money we didn't have but that his new attorney arranged through a payment plan that would take him 5 years to complete. "At least it's over," he said when we signed that agreement. But it wasn't over. The financial and legal consequences created a cascade of problems that defined our relationship. Every decision we made was filtered through the lens of what we could afford, what we could risk, what we could legally do, without triggering new problems. The stress destroyed whatever romance had originally brought us together. Within 6 months of moving, we were barely speaking. Within a year, Marcus had moved out. "I can't do this anymore," he told me as he packed his single suitcase. "This whole thing has turned into a nightmare that never ends. So you're abandoning me too?" "I'm not abandoning you. I'm trying to survive. And I can't survive this." After he left, I sat alone in the tiny studio apartment I could barely afford, surrounded by the wreckage of my choices, and finally understood what my husband had accomplished. He hadn't just protected his assets or punished my betrayal. He'd demonstrated the true cost of deception in a way that would follow me for years. Every job application that required a credit check. Every rental application that asked about previous addresses. Every relationship that might have offered a fresh start, but faltered when the full story emerged. The administrative dissolution of our marriage had been swift and efficient. The dissolution of my life afterward was slow and thorough. And somewhere, in a house that was entirely his, with a daughter who called him every week and a law practice that had gained new clients, impressed by his handling of a complex marital asset protection case, my ex-husband was probably sleeping peacefully. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always come with dramatic courtroom scenes. Sometimes it came with the quiet efficiency of well-prepared legal documents and the long-term consequences of choices that seemed exciting in the moment, but proved devastating over time. 2 years later, I sit in a cramped studio apartment 3 states away from everything I used to call home, and I finally understand the full scope of what I lost. Not just the house, the money, or the comfortable life I'd grown tired of. I lost the respect of the only people who mattered, the security that comes from building something real with someone who loved me, and most painfully, the version of myself that I used to be proud of. My daughter graduated college last month. I saw the photos on social media, her and her father beaming together, him looking proud and distinguished in his expensive suit, her glowing with accomplishment and promise. I wasn't invited to the ceremony. I wasn't even told about it until after. She's engaged now to that boy from her economics class. They're planning a wedding for next spring. I learned about it the same way I learn about most of her life, through carefully worded social media posts that somehow manage to share good news while making it clear that I'm not part of it. Her father is walking her down the aisle. He's also paying for the wedding, the honeymoon, and the down payment on their first house. He's become the kind of father who shows love through actions rather than words, the kind of man who builds foundations for his daughter's future. I send her cards on holidays. Sometimes she responds with a polite text message. "We haven't spoken on the phone in over a year. Marcus disappeared completely about 18 months ago. Last I heard, he'd moved back in with his parents in another state and was trying to rebuild his relationship with his children. The ones whose support payments got him into legal trouble in the first place. He blocked me on all social media after I made the mistake of reaching out one too many times when I was feeling lonely. I don't blame him. Being with me had cost him everything too. I work now as a night shift clerk at a gas station. It's honest work, and it's all I could find with my destroyed credit and the gaps in my employment history. The overnight hours suit me, fewer people to potentially recognize me, fewer conversations about my past. During the quiet hours between 2 and 6 a.m., when the only customers are truckers and insomniacs, I have a lot of time to think about how I got here. I don't think my husband set out to destroy my life. I think he set out to protect his own, and my destruction was just the inevitable consequence of the choices I made. The most painful realization is that he tried to warn me, in his way. All those years of growing distant, of seeming disinterested, of not fighting for our marriage. He wasn't giving up on me. He was protecting himself from me. He'd seen who I was becoming before I'd even admitted it to myself. Last week, I drove past our old neighborhood. Just curious, I told myself, though I knew it was a mistake. The house looked beautiful, well-maintained, with new landscaping and a fresh coat of paint. There was a different car in the driveway, a compact sedan that suggested someone practical and responsible was visiting. I sat there for a few minutes, remembering Sunday mornings in that kitchen, holiday dinners around that dining room table, quiet evenings reading in that living room. A life that had seemed boring at the time, but looked like paradise from my current perspective. He'd remarried 6 months ago. I found out through a former mutual friend who thought I should know. A woman from his office, a paralegal who'd worked with him for years. Someone who understood his world, respected his work, appreciated his steady nature. Someone who probably saw his predictability as reliability rather than limitation. The friend said they seemed very happy together, that my daughter liked her, that she'd attended the graduation ceremony and the engagement party, that she was helping plan the wedding, that she'd seamlessly stepped into the life I'd thrown away. I don't know if this story has a lesson, or if it's just the natural consequence of believing that excitement matters more than commitment, that passion matters more than partnership, that the grass is always greener somewhere else. What I know is that I traded 15 years of something real for 6 months of something that felt like a movie. And now I'm alone in a studio apartment, working overnight shifts to pay rent I can barely afford, while the man I thought was too boring to love has built himself a new life with someone who appreciates what he has to offer. My husband didn't just win our divorce. He demonstrated that sometimes the quiet, steady people are the ones who have the deepest strength. That sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply letting someone live with the consequences of their own choices. That sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about protection. And sometimes the person you should have been most afraid of disappointing was the one who loved you quietly, completely, and carefully for 15 years. The one who knew you well enough to prepare for the day you'd break his heart. The one who loved you enough to let you go, and smart enough to make sure you couldn't take him down with you when you fell.